Thank you for joining us in our third online town hall with Foundation for Economic Education. My name is Silenas, but you can call me short for Z, and I'm the president of Foundation for Economic Education. We have an excellent program prepared for you today. We have around 400 people registered for this event, which I think just proves the fact that many people care about the topic we're going to explore today. Just before we jump in, we have a Zoom feature, which is questions and answers. So if at any time you want to submit questions to any of our panelists or me, you can just use the Zoom's Q&A feature, and our panelists will answer that after their speeches. So today's topic is about occupational licensing reform. Why is this important, or why is it really important in the days of current crisis? Well, the way I see things, any crisis is obviously calls for a change. And one of the biggest changes that can happen in the economy is people, starting doing different things. People stop doing things that they're no longer needed, and they start doing things that people actually want. So maybe hairdressers doing home deliveries, or I've heard that in some, I think it's in New York, that restaurant chefs are now cooking for billionaires. Now, of course, not every one of us can hire a Michelin 3-star chef to cook at home, but the point is, if the economy can move resources from activities that are no longer productive into activities that are, this is, I think, how adjustment, this is how recovery happens. And the way I see it, these licensing or occupational licensing is one of the great unnecessary barriers that prevent people from switching jobs, starting new businesses, and today we're going to talk about that. And we have two excellent speakers who actually know what they're talking about. And we have one of them is John Riches. He's a director of national litigation for the Goldwater Institute Scarf Norton Center for Constitutional Litigation and general counsel for the Institute. Whew, that was a mouthful. But he has developed and authored several pieces of legislation, including the landmark Right to Earn a Living Act, which provides some of the greatest protections in the country of job seekers and entrepreneurs who face arbitrary licensing regulation. And additional fact, he's an officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve and a native of Phoenix, Arizona. Hello, John.
How you doing today, Z? Thanks for having us on.
Good. And the second person we have is Dr. Edward Timmons, and he's a professor of economics and the director of NE Center for the Study of Occupational Regulation at St. Francis University. And he is one of the world's leading scholars on the effects of occupational regulations. His research has been extensively published. He's been cited among scholarly journals, popular press, the White House, Senate hearings. And Dr. Timmons has been a member of St. Francis University faculty since 2008 and serves as a coordinator for the economics major. Hello, Edward.
Hi, Z. How are you?
We are good. Let's get this party started. Let's start with John. So, John, share some of thoughts. What needs to be done in the country so we can actually, our road to recovery is faster as opposed to lagging.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks for having us on, Z. Thanks to Fee and Dr. Timmons as well for joining. This is one of those topics that I think, in light of the recent crisis, has taken on some exponentially more import for regular everyday folks. So we'll start with the basics. What is occupational licensing? Most of our callers probably know, but it's essentially a government permission slip to work. What's interesting about occupational licenses is about 50 years ago, 1 in 20 jobs, or 5%, required a government permission slip before you could enter that profession. And those were in areas that you would think make some sense. Healthcare was the predominant industry. Today, depending on what state you're in, about a quarter to a third of all jobs require an occupational license. Some of these are healthcare related, law, etc. Others appear to have no real nexus to the public's health and safety whatsoever. For example, in Vermont, chimney sweepers are licensed, bed salespeople in West Virginia are licensed. In the state of in the state of Louisiana, florists are licensed. And I'm told that in order to become a licensed florist in the state of Louisiana, you have to take a written exam, which is challenging, and then you have to arrange flowers in a sufficiently beautiful way that is then judged by the incumbent industry by 3 people who are already licensed florists, and they must deem your floral arrangement sufficiently beautiful before the government will give you the benefit of selling flowers in the great state of Louisiana. So all that is to say, it's become an enormous barrier to entry for a lot of professions. So the first problem with occupational licensing is just too much stuff is licensed. Stuff that has no apparent nexus to protecting the public requires you to go to the government and satisfy its arbitrary criteria before you can work in the job of your choice. But of course, when you try to go in and repeal some of these occupational licenses, the special interests come out in mass. You'll hear all about the dangers of having unlicensed florists and how people can prick their fingers and how dirty soil is. And so it becomes a political challenge to kind of one-off repeal these, although I think those efforts should continue and those efforts should be supported. But kind of counterintuitively, when you take a holistic approach to occupational licensing reform, it can be both more impactful and in some ways is an easier political lift than targeting specific professions. So I want to talk very briefly about two such reforms that the Goldwater Institute helped develop and then saw implemented throughout the country, including here in Arizona. The first pertains to occupational mobility, and I think this one is just crucial in light of the current crisis. So part of the problem with occupational licensing is that each state has varying occupational licensing requirements. So what Arizona might require for a cosmetologist to be licensed might be very different than Texas. And of course, if you move from Texas or California to Arizona, you then have to satisfy whatever Arizona's requirements are before you can get an occupational license. And these things vary from state to state, and it creates a real mobility problem. So you have, at least up until about 2 months ago, you have an unemployment rate that's very low for the general population. But then when you look at subsets of the population that are highly mobile, and for example, we've done a lot of research and analysis around military spouses, because of course, military members move every 2 to 3 years, their spouses and their families move with them. They have a much higher unemployment rate in the range of 24%, compared to about 4% as of 2 months ago, of course. So that's just not obviously unique to military spouses. More and more people are mobile. I think we've all learned that throughout this crisis, that mobility is a reality in the way that we live and we work. You can open your computer and work from your home pretty much anywhere. So when you have these arbitrary barriers, it prevents people from moving around in what may make a lot of sense for themselves, for their profession, for their families, et cetera. So we helped develop a law, what we're called breaking down barriers to work, which is a pretty novel concept. It basically recognizes that if you drive from the state of Florida to the state of Georgia and you're a cosmetologist, you don't forget how to cut hair on the drive out there. So what the law does is it says if you're a licensed professional in one state and you've held your license for a year and you don't have any disciplinary actions or anything like that pending against you, then your license will be recognized in the state where you move into. So Arizona was the first state in the country to pass this measure. Pennsylvania shortly followed suit. About 7 other states have implemented this, and it's been introduced in about 24 states. Where now, if you're licensed in another state and you move into one of these states, that state will automatically recognize your license if you satisfy basically those minimum criteria of having held the license for a year or more. So that's a tremendous reform. A lot of enormous early success here in Arizona. Dozens and dozens of industries have been impacted. Thousands of individuals have sought and received licensure. So that's a great reform in light of this pandemic, where you see states sort of unilaterally suspending some of their licensing requirements. This is a way to get ahead of that curve and ensure that if people are licensed and can safely and efficiently practice their profession in one state, they can do that in another state. That addresses the mobility issue, which is a big problem with occupational licensing. Second reform, which I'll briefly mention, pertains to when the government interferes with your ability to get a license. So there's a real accountability problem in this space. And I'll give you a quick example. So if the government were to, for example, interfere with your right to free speech, it would tell FEE that they couldn't hold this teleforum. and Fee were to go to court and say, hey, the government's interfering with my First Amendment right to free speech, what the court would do is it would turn to the government and say, you better have a really, really good reason for restricting that right. And whatever restriction you used, better advance that reason. It would be subject to what's called strict scrutiny, which is the highest form of judicial review when you're challenging government action. The exact opposite is true when it comes to economic freedom and when it specifically comes to occupational licensing. If you were to challenge, for example, if the government were to tell somebody that braids hair, that they need to go to cosmetology school, and they were to respond that, well, 0 hours of the 1,600-hour requirement for cosmetology has to do with hair braiding, which is true in most states. The court would turn to the government and say, there's probably a health or safety concern in here somewhere. And they would subject that government regulation to what's called rational basis review, which is essentially a rubber stamp of government activity. And so what happens is we have a system set up where regulators know that they can set up arbitrary, irrational regulations. And in all but the most irrational cases, those licensing restrictions are going to be upheld. And sometimes in completely irrational cases, those licensing restrictions are going to be upheld. So that naturally results in more and more licensing requirements, more arbitrary regulation. We developed a law, which we call the Right to Earn a Living Act, which basically elevates the standard of review to something higher than that. It requires that if the government's going to regulate in this space, it has to be for the public's health and safety, and whatever regulation the government uses has to advance that health or safety justification. That's law of the land in Arizona. Tennessee has passed a version. Many other states have considered versions of it. That addresses the accountability piece. It ensures less regulation, less arbitrary regulation, and we've seen quite a bit of success in the areas where it's been enacted. So with those two broad overviews, kick it over to Dr. Timmons and look forward to everyone's questions.
Absolutely. Well, let me abuse, and by the way, this is an unlicensed. This is not a licensed teleforum, so I shall abuse my position. And I'm not a licensed teleforum caster, so I'm just going to abuse my position and just jump into a quick question. The mutual sort of recognition of if sort of licensing in each state. Well, let me sort of throw two curveball questions at you. So some people might come out and say, sure, this mismatch of different regulations is awful. Let's just have federally licensed florists and everything will be fine. That's sort of the route that European Union is taking, saying since we kind of work together, we should work together by the same rules. So there'll be one question. And the second question, if this sort of mutual recognition of licensing continues, what do you envision? Is it going to be like a race to the bottom, meaning less regulation, the one I would love to, or will it actually be race to the top where the biggest states, let's say California, would start kind of through their weird system of licensing, will start exporting their standards to the rest of the country like they try to do with, let's say, car makers?
Sure, yeah. So taking your first question first, of course, we would not advocate for a federal solution to this problem. The federal government is a system of limited power. States retain their police powers. Of course, what we would see if the feds tried to get involved here is probably, layers of regulation rather than less regulation, where the feds would do some of it, states would do some of it, and it would probably create more of a problem than the problem it was intended to solve. So I don't think that is the answer. To the extent the federal government wanted to incentivize lower barriers to entry, I think things like that maybe could be explored. But this is at bottom a state regulatory issue, which I think gets to your second question. Would we see greater regulatory response or heightened regulatory barriers? And I don't think that we would. I think what we see, and in fact, what we have seen as states lower their barriers, they start to look to their neighbors and say, oh, well, we have recognized these licenses from neighboring states. Maybe we really didn't need those 1,600 hours to be a cosmetologist. Maybe it could be satisfied by reducing that to, 200 hours or no hours. And I think that states are learning from each other, and they're seeing that the Chicken Little crowd that often comes out when you advocate for these reforms and say, the minute you stop licensing, landscape architects, all hell's going to break loose, and that doesn't happen. I think you see policy responses where that's like, well, maybe those were not necessary in the first case. So I think it will actually lead to a lighter regulatory touch across the country.
All right, perfect. Let's switch to Mr. Dr. Edward Timmons from a knee center. Obviously, feel free to reflect on what we just talked about, but how do you see the situation? Is there a way to deregulate? Is there a way to get rid of these unnecessary regulations and unleash the horror of federally unlicensed florists? What can we do in this kind of environment? Is this an opportunity?
Yeah, I certainly think it is. I think in light of what's transpired with COVID-19, I think what states have begun to realize is that some of the regulations that are in place just don't seem to make a lot of sense. John did a really nice job of kind of setting up what the landscape looks like with occupational licensing. And I figured I'd focus primarily on occupational licensing in the healthcare space. John had mentioned that 1 in 5 workers today is subject to occupational licensing. If one looks at healthcare and education, more than 40% of workers are subject to occupational licensing. Now, occupational licensing at least is on paper meant to make sure that we have access to good quality care, but if occupational licensing is in fact preventing folks from obtaining care at all, one has to stop and wonder. It comes back to the old Cadillac argument. It'd be really great if everybody had access to a Cadillac, but unfortunately, it would definitely be better for people to have cars than to all just have to have a Cadillac and not necessarily have access to it. And if we're looking at rural areas in the United States, a quarter of Americans live in rural areas, and rural areas are where we see some of the most challenges with respect to access to care. More than 7,000 areas in the United States are listed as having health professional shortages, and newly minted doctors just don't have an interest, for a variety of reasons, in moving to smaller cities. Now, I'm not going to claim by any stretch of the imagination that some of the reforms that I talk about here are a panacea and that they're going to solve every single challenge with respect to healthcare in the United States. However, I think that these reforms are sensible, and I think these reforms, as has been shown in other states, are reforms that can get done. So I'm just going to take a look at the state of scope of practice for nurse practitioners. I'm going to share a graphic with everyone. So hopefully you all can see that. This graphic shows what nurse practitioner practice authority looks like on a state-by-state basis. And the states in the green, there's 22 of them, and the District of Columbia, nurse practitioners are free to practice to the full extent of their training, and they don't have to obtain a contract with a doctor. They don't have to be supervised by a doctor. They're permitted to work and do what they're trained to do. In the states in the yellow in the map, nurse practitioners have to enter into a collaborative practice agreement with physicians. And this places limitations on what nurse practitioners can do and how well they can fulfill some of the challenges and some of the shortages that we see with respect to primary care. States in the red, in many of them, nurse practitioners have to be directly supervised by physicians. Now, there's been a lot of research that has taken a look at what the effects of allowing nurse practitioners to do what they're trained to do has with respect to access to care and with respect to quality. For instance, research shows that expanding nurse practitioner scope of practice has no effect at all on infant mortality. And at the same time, it also reduces the prices of a routine well child exam. Additional research shows that if you expand nurse practitioner scope of practice, Medicaid patients are able to receive more care without increasing cost. The training that nurse practitioners receive doesn't vary from state to state. So one has to wonder, why is it that we see these differences with respect to what nurse practitioners are permitted to do? And in light of COVID-19, what we've seen is, as John mentioned, a number of states have recognized other states' licenses. In addition, many states have scaled back their requirements for nurse practitioner scope of practice. They're allowing nurse practitioners to work to the full extent of their training without physician supervision and without entering into a collaborative practice agreement. Now, if we're specifically looking at pregnant mothers or expecting mothers, certified nurse midwives are another non-physician that can step in and provide care. And again, we see in rural areas that individuals might have challenges obtaining access to the care that they need. And if we take a look at the practice environment for certified nurse midwives, we're going to see a similar discrepancy from state to state. Here is the state of affairs for certified nurse midwives. Again, states in the green, certified nurse midwives are allowed to work independently, whereas states in the yellow, they have to enter into a collaborative practice agreement, and states in the red, they have to be supervised. So again, we see these differences from state to state with respect to what certified nurse midwives are permitted to do. And we do have research suggesting, in this case with certified nurse midwives, if you do have greater practice authority for certified nurse midwives, you see fewer cesarean sections and less induced labor. So if anything, it would seem there's no other quality differences. If anything, it would seem like patients are receiving less invasive and perhaps cheaper treatment by certified nurse midwives instead of receiving treatment from a physician. And just to wrap up my comments, I'll talk a little bit about dentistry. We haven't really seen a whole lot on the dental front because of lockdowns. Of course, a lot of folks can't even see their dentist right now, except for emergency procedures. But even prior to the crisis, where we had lockdowns in many states, what we saw is that a lot of folks weren't able to get access to the dental care that they needed. That there simply wasn't a dentist within reasonable driving distance, and that was a major reason that many individuals listed as why they couldn't get access to the care that they need. Now, unlike with physicians, where you do have a variety of other professionals that can fill in the gap, in oral health, you don't see as much. And there are some folks that advocate for creating a new license. Maybe that's one license that we can live with, one new license, I don't know. I've seen good arguments either way. But adding a dental therapist as a new licensed profession in order to fill in some of the gaps with respect to providing dental care. But even if you don't like that, you don't like the idea of a new licensed professionals, we do have dental hygienists. And there are significant differences from state to state with respect to what dental hygienists are permitted to do and the practice environment that they encounter. So my last graphic that I'll show is what the practice environment looks like for dental hygienists from state to state. And with this, unfortunately, I wasn't able to create this one myself, so the color coding is a little bit different. But the states that are lighter, so states like Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, states that do have significant rural populations, these are the states that have the most restrictive environment for dental hygienists. They have to work very closely under supervision of dentists. They don't have a lot of autonomy. States in the blue in the map are states that have less restrictive practice environments. Now, California was in the red, and we don't often look to California as a beacon of openness. But with respect to dental hygienist practice, California does score pretty well with respect to what dental hygienists are permitted to do. And I have a paper that I wrote with Ji Chen and Chad Meyerhofer that looks at how differences in dental hygienist autonomy affects access to care. And what we find, and it's not all that surprising, is that if you do allow dental hygienists more autonomy and permit them to do more, what you find is that folks have access to more dental care. And in addition, the prices of providing that care fall. So at least in my very humble opinion, these sorts of reforms are no-brainers. And we've seen states very quickly, very willingly roll back, not, as I mentioned, not so much the dental ones, but nurse practitioner scope of practice, certified nurse midwife scope of practice. We've seen states roll these back without very much deliberation. So one really has to wonder, why do we have these restrictions in the first place? And my hope is that once we move out of this crisis, states will carefully reconsider these regulations and think about moving more into the green or more into the blue, depending upon the color coding in the map.
Thank you, Ed. I think the work you're doing is simply great. And with all respect to florists, it's one thing to convince the public that perhaps arrangement of floral bouquets could be unlicensed. But the things you're talking about is sort of rolling back regulation on nurses, midwives, dentists, and people are usually pretty skittish about their health. So let me put you on the spotlight for 30 seconds. How would you convince a general person or just a person on the street that we should deregulate, let's say, nursing or midwifing?
Yeah, so it's always kind of a sky's falling, kind of Chicken Little sort of situation, and it's almost always physicians that will be screaming the loudest that we can't bear to allow these nurse practitioners to do what they're trained to do. And what I would say is that states have already scaled back what nurse practitioners face with respect to regulatory hurdles. And we haven't seen all of the dire worst case scenarios that we hear about in the states where there's a lot of reluctance to do so. And I haven't really seen any sort of suggestion or any evidence of the temporary rollbacks that we've seen leading to any significant challenges or complications. So we just don't have evidence. And the nice thing is that if a state were to act, they wouldn't be the only state that would be enacting these reforms. There already are a large number of states. I mentioned the 22 states in DC that grant nurse practitioners full autonomy. There's 29 states in DC that grant certified nurse midwives full practice authority. So it wouldn't be a situation where a state would be casting out on its own. There are many states that have enacted these types of reforms.
All right, we have excellent questions coming in from our audience, and please keep them coming up. So let's go for the simple Q&A. This is a question for both. Who are the biggest offenders of occupational licensing abuse, and what are the solutions how to exit the system? So I guess its offenders could be either agencies, federal agencies, or states, however you want to interpret. So who are the offenders and how do we exit them?
I'll give a first crack at that. Really interesting statistic is there's fewer than 30 occupations that are licensed in every single state. And over half of all licensed professions are only licensed in one state. So if you think about that for a minute, you have a whole lot of occupational licenses that exist in some places that don't exist at all in other places. And then you have very few licensed professions where basically all the states agree, maybe these should be, you and I might not agree about this, but the states generally will say, maybe these 30 or so professions should receive a license. So I say that because I think that's very, very compelling evidence that a lot of states are getting this wrong. Some of the worst offenders, it varies. There's some like kind of strange outliers that you wouldn't think. Some traditionally more limited government states that have higher regulatory barriers, but your traditional offenders are, California is obviously a big mess. State of New York is pretty bad in many regards, but honestly, this doesn't necessarily just break down upon more pro-liberty states versus less pro-liberty states. The sad reality of occupational licensing is the special interests have been pretty successful in capturing many different occupations throughout the country in many different states.
All right, Ed, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I don't know if I'm an expert on hair care. You can look at my hairstyle, but I mean, some of the worst offenders, as far as I'm concerned, are folks in the hairstyling business. You see significant differences across states with respect to barber licensing requirements and cosmetologist licensing requirements. Weird restrictions that the haircut can only be given in a physical location, and broadening of the definition. John talked about hair braiders, and the fact that folks that want to be hair braiders still, thankfully, because of the good work of the Goldwater Institute and the Institute for Justice, a number of states no longer require hair braiders to get a cosmetology license, but there's still some. There's still a handful of states where if somebody wants to work as a hair braider, they have to complete 1,000 hours of education and training or more. And a lot of that education or training might not have anything to do with it. And, as states start to reconsider if licensing is the right approach, I think probably barbers and cosmetologists should have some training in hygiene. I mean, that makes good sense. But I don't understand why a barber or a cosmetologist needs 1,000 hours of education and training that's dictated by the state and is very rigid, and the requirements just don't seem to have much rhyme or reason.
And we all remember that sort of funny story from North Korea that there are 17 officially licensed haircuts for all people. Hey, so maybe that's the way to go. You learn 17 styles, you don't need 1,000 hours, and there is order. All right, moving on. Excellent question from one of our viewers. Will the acceleration to remote work, even sometimes across national boundaries, help to naturally circumvent licensing requirements?
Probably. I think that more and more we're experiencing the ability to do this, and it's just going to, as a practical matter, be harder for state regulators to kind of come at people working remotely. And on the policy perspective, people are going to recognize that, if I can do all this stuff safely remotely, why do I have to get a license in the first instance? There's still going to be the regulators. There's still going to be people that are, getting caught up in some of this stuff. The state licensing boards are going to say, even though, you might be licensed in one state, if you're working remotely in our state, even though you're only providing services to the state where you're licensed, we're going to come at you. So that's why I still think you need a policy response on a lot of this stuff to prevent that. I made the point. A lot of what happens in this field and on the regulatory side happens below the legislative radar. So obviously it's stupid for legislators to say you need 1,600 hours to be a cosmetologist. That's obviously just bad policy. But a lot of the real harm happens below that level at the regulatory agency, where they tell, for example, we represent a woman named Lauren Boyce, and I'll tell a real quick story because I think it speaks to this point. Lauren contracted cancer. And while she was undergoing chemo treatment, she couldn't leave her house. And she couldn't leave it to get much of anything done. But one thing she couldn't get done is cosmetology services, couldn't get her haircut, makeup done. Fortunately, she survived. And like all good entrepreneurs in this country, she saw a demand in the market for mobile cosmetology services. So she started a business called Angels on Earth, where she would dispatch licensed cosmetologists, people who already held that government permission slip. She dispatched those licensed cosmetologists to people's homes, either because they were too sick or they otherwise couldn't leave their home. Well, in stepped the Arizona Board of Cosmetology, and they told Lauren that she needed a salon license in order to operate this business. To which she reasonably responded, I don't operate a salon. I also don't cut anybody's hair or do anybody's makeup. I'm merely just a dispatcher. I'm sending people who are already licensed to people's homes. They persisted. We got involved. Fortunately, we won an early litigation victory, and the board backed off. But so much of the harm is happening at that level, where you have this irrational regulatory response, where something's so crazy that even if you don't operate a salon, you need a salon license. Stuff like that's going to be imposed. Stuff like that's probably going to be upheld by the courts, which makes some of these reforms, like the Right to Earn a Living Act, particularly important.
Well, let me pile up another question for Ed. The chart about dental hygienists you showed, some folks find it really surprising. So why is Southeast so restrictive? I mean, how come, in that sense, California is doing better than Georgia?
Yeah, it's hard to speculate why we see certain regions. I mean, it could very well be that for whatever reason, physicians and doctors just have more clout. I've heard anecdotally about, potentially the representatives or the senators might be physicians or dentists themselves, or perhaps the folks that are doing the decision making are wives of physicians or dentists. And unfortunately, you do have a lot of these vested interests that do unfortunately penetrate and capture the regulatory process. I haven't seen anybody definitively, try and hammer home, why we see these differences. But if I had to guess, those are the driving forces behind why we see areas in the Southeast for all of those three professions with more restrictive regulatory regimes for the providers.
All right, we have another excellent question coming from our viewers. Please keep those questions coming. So, of the occupational licensing reforms that have been lifted during the pandemic, which ones do you think will be sort of lifted permanently? So which sort of reforms that happened due to pandemic will persist even after the pandemic is gone?
I think one of the most obvious ones is the recognition of out-of-state licenses. So, what you had is a situation in places like New York that were particularly hard hit. They had a shortage of healthcare professionals. They said, well, we have all these healthcare professionals right across the way in New Jersey. Why don't we automatically recognize their training, their experience? They can obviously safely practice their profession. They've been doing it in their own state. So I think that those are sort of hopefully the low-hanging fruit, and why something like universal licensure, breaking down barriers to work, why that is just a common sense reform that now we have good experience to show is also, very good and effective policy.
All right, Ed?
Yeah, and I agree. I think that the recognition of out-of-state licenses would probably make the most sense. And just to come back to a point that you asked earlier about the potential of ratcheting up, I'm much more concerned about that where you're looking at compacts, where you have some sort of federal or some sort of national attempt to recognize licenses for things like nurses and doctors, where you have that additional layer of bureaucracy. That's where I'd be most concerned about a possible ratcheting up. I think those concerns are less worrisome if you just have simple recognition, because there you don't have any additional layer of bureaucracy. And my hope is that more states move in that direction rather than getting on the compact route of recognizing out-of-state licensing.
All right, another excellent question from our viewers, and it goes like this. Can you speak to the fact that professions that require expertise would still use training and credentials even if governments were not directly involved in the licensing aspect? I think that's a very sort of, once again, excellent curveball question. So sure, we can tell the government to get out, but would that mean the end of licensing and the end of sort of regulation as we know it?
No, of course not. I think what you see already in licensed professions is people still do go get specialized private training, private certifications. It's particularly true, and Dr. Timmons could probably talk about it in the healthcare field, where you might need a state occupational license from the state, from the government, to be a physician, but physicians have a whole range of private certifications that make them more valuable marketplace actors. I think you would see that across industries. There's no reason why you can't have private certifications, private training take the place of government mandates across a whole host of industries. And this is kind of a little bit of a silly example, but I think it's an important one. Prior to the invention of Uber and Lyft, you had taxi drivers that were licensed with medallions and other sort of licensing schemes in every single state. In the state of New York, it cost almost $1 million to get a taxi medallion in order to drive a taxi. Well, in stepped Uber, Lyft. You now have a much safer, better experienced product at a much lower cost in an industry that had failed to innovate for well over half of a century. And that was not a government mandate that did that. That was just a private solution. And now you have a situation where consumers have more information available to them. They can make decisions about what drivers they may or may not want to go with. And I think that those same sorts of principles can be applied across industries.
All right, Ed?
Yeah, I mean, there already are a lot of industries where private certification does the job. I mean, for instance, auto mechanics, you don't see any sort of state involvement in the licensing process, and yet consumers are able to decide, do you want to see a professionally certified mechanic, or do you want to see a mechanic that might lack that certification? So, and John mentioned that there have been a lot of technological innovations. I mean, we as consumers just have access to a lot more information than we had access to when these laws were written. Many of these laws were written more than 100 years ago, and the marketplace is just so different. And yet the laws remain, and there's just a rigidity. There's no willingness to reconsider, what if we need such a restrictive law in the marketplace that we're currently in.
Quick question. So Elon Musk last week did some sort of civil disobedience. One of California counties said, "Thou shalt not open," and Elon Musk did anyway and said sort of, "I am Spartacus, come arrest me." Now, do you think that's a road to deregulation, or you pretty much have to be Elon Musk to pull that off?
Well, going back to the Uber Lyft example, that is actually what you saw as these ride-sharing platforms were first entering the market. A lot of them did not go and ask for permission from the government. A lot of them just started operating in the market, even when there were some borderline gray cases where maybe they were taxis, maybe they weren't. And what we saw happen there is that the public recognized that these private solutions where more information was available to riders and drivers, and they were able to communicate freely and share information freely, actually worked. The public actually liked it, and they almost built up a political base, or at least a base of public support, before they then went to the regulators. And unfortunately, you saw some ride-sharing companies try to get protectionist carve-outs for themselves, but the public support was so strong already that it was hard to go back and regulate in the aftermath.
Okay, Ed, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I just add that technology and entrepreneurship in general have demonstrated that you are going to see aspiring entrepreneurs or advancements in technology that circumvent the law and find ways that we can move past that law. And my hope is, and I think that I'm correct, that I'm very optimistic about what we're going to see after this crisis, and individuals looking for ways to perhaps move us past a lot of these regulatory hurdles if they persist.
Okay, let me merge. We have so many questions, so let me merge two questions into one. One of our viewers writes, "I am not a fan of federal government forcing anything on the states." Agreed here. But is there anything that can be done at the federal level to limit states' ability to require licensing or hinder states' expansion of occupational licensing rules and regulations? So basically the question is, is there perhaps a case for federal government reining in the state governments? And there's a second sort of question I think ties into this. Says, do you believe that if the Chevron rule were reversed, then government would be required to carry the burden of proof that the licensing regime is reasonable? Okay, so two very wonky questions for you.
I'll take a quick first crack because the Chevron thing is probably more directed for us wonky lawyers. Well, first, the federal question: what can the federal government do? I don't see any reason why the federal government couldn't incentivize certain policies that lower barriers to entry. So if a state passed something like universal licensing, maybe some federal funding about jobs training or something like that is tied to states that have implemented policies that reduce these sorts of barriers to entry. So I think that's one possible role. I think we'd have to think through it very carefully, and there's some landmines, but I think that is definitely a possibility. And the second one, Chevron deference. This is a legal doctrine that many of your viewers might know, which says that if a regulator comes after you and says that you violated a state statute that is arguably ambiguous, and as we all know, most statutes are somewhat ambiguous, but if a regulator says that you violated a statute and it's arguably ambiguous and you say, no, I didn't. I think statute Y means A, and the regulator says, no, statute Y means B. If you go to court over that question, then the courts are obligated to defer to the government's interpretation of the law. Think about that for a second. That means you have two equal parties, a private party and the government, where they should be equal before a neutral, independent arbiter, neutral judiciary, but because of things like Chevron deference, courts are obligated to put their thumb on the scale for the government. Just this horrendous doctrine that has resulted in many ways this expansion of the size and scope of the administrative state. So the question is, if you eliminated that, and by the way, we did eliminate that in Arizona, the Goldwater Institute drafted a statute which eliminated both Chevron and our deference, separate issue, but a similar type of deference at the state level, and that was passed 2 years ago. Then would this help? Absolutely, it would help, because it goes back to this accountability problem where regulators know, because of things like Chevron deference, because of standards of review, they're not going to get challenged. If they are challenged, they're probably going to win. But if you get rid of all this stuff, if you get rid of thumb on the scale for the government, they start thinking, oh, well, wow, maybe we really better think through this regulation before we impose it. We really better think through this decision before we make it. And it will result, and it has resulted here in Arizona, in less arbitrary decision-making and less regulation.
All right, Ed?
Yeah, I won't comment on the Chevron difference. I think John's done a very nice job of summarizing that. I mean, I just say, as far as what the federal government can do, the Department of Labor, for instance, already has made some funding available to states that are willing to take a hard look at occupational licensing and do some sort of review. So I think providing some sort of incentive, serving as a resource. Both the previous administration and the Trump administration have provided guidance to states. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate way to just kind of give a push. I completely respect states and want states to be the ones that make the final call. But I think that the federal government, at the very least, can serve as a sounding board and serve as a resource as to what the lay of the land is with respect to licensing. And both of the previous administrations did that.
Okay, another question for you guys, coming from one of our readers, is are there any good examples among the states or the governors who are taking an aggressive deregulation during this pandemic? Basically, are there good politicians from whom other politicians could learn? Don't all just jump in right away. Or does that mean there is no one to learn from?
I think the states that have been quick to recognize that some of these barriers are probably not necessary and are probably causing more harm than they are creating protection for the public's health and safety ought to be emulated. And so I don't have great examples right off the tip of my head because the responses have been so varied. Both some states that maybe have suspended some regulatory requirements have also imposed kind of more onerous emergency measures. So you got to be a little bit careful about balancing those two things. I will say, though, that after all this is over, we're going to have an awful lot of data to look back at and say, hey, look, when you suspended those regulatory requirements for nurse practitioners or you name it, and what happened is that more people were able to get care more efficiently. I think we're going to have that data. We saw that in Texas, actually, after the hurricanes a couple years back. The governor of Texas suspended a whole bunch of regulations that were in place, both for occupational licensing and for other sorts of emergency response measures. And then he extended those suspensions month after month for about a year. So you have this wonderful pool of data where you saw all of these occupational licensing suspensions and other regulatory waivers where, of course, the sky didn't fall. People were, the public's health and safety was protected. So I think we're going to see that across the states after this thing is all said and done.
Yeah, and I'd echo John's sentiment. I think with respect to the crisis, we've seen states act quickly, but it can be hard to gauge, exactly who's done a better job. I think we'll probably have a better sense of that in the coming months. But what I will say is that prior to the crisis, you did see a lot of states implement some significant reforms. For instance, Arizona implemented the Right to Earn a Living Act and was the first state to move forward with universal recognition of other states' licenses. We've seen a number of states follow forward with that, with states potentially recognizing other states' licenses. Both Ohio and Nebraska enacted laws that force occupational licensing to be subject to sunset reviews. So I think you see states taking a couple of different approaches. And I should mention Florida. Florida's also removed a couple of occupational licenses this year as well. You've seen states take these different approaches, and time I think will tell what one of these approaches is best at trying to curtail growth in occupational licensing. Unfortunately, the momentum has still been towards more and more licensing. The hope is that these reforms will, at the very least, slow that down and perhaps get us to a point where we don't see 1 in 5 workers obtaining a license.
Okay, final question. Where are the greatest opportunities for impactful change coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic? Not necessarily in cosmetics or healthcare, but economic growth and productivity opportunities. Can we come out of this stronger?
Absolutely. I think we can, and I think we will. I think what we've seen is that both private individuals and private industry have been just tremendously resilient under extraordinarily difficult circumstances and have been making decisions and adapting and implementing new technologies and new policies that didn't require any state mandate, that just required a shifting of practices that worked for consumers and for businesses. And I think we're all going to learn an awful lot about that. We're all going to learn a lot about efficiencies with our own work performance. And I think that we certainly will come out of this stronger than we entered it into. And I think we're going to come out of it stronger, not because of some government mandate, but because free people were able to make free decisions that ended up working out better and more efficiently for everybody.
Yeah, I look, for instance, at how quickly, for instance, breweries were able to adapt and begin producing hand sanitizer. So I'm just very, very hopeful about the entrepreneurial spirit. And I think that we're going to see, I'm hopefully optimistic that we're going to see some significant action and some ways for entrepreneurs to adapt in this new environment. I think, if anything, entrepreneurs have demonstrated their flexibility throughout all of this.
Z, I got to jump in. Real quick right there on this hand sanitizer example. This one's too good to let pass before we stop. Maui Brewing company out in Hawaii, which is one of I think it is the largest brewer on the island. They did exactly what Dr. Timmons said. They started to produce hand sanitizer because they could safely and efficiently do that. They gave it to first-line healthcare responders, and they then, noticing that people had a shortage of hand sanitizer, if somebody bought a product at one of their restaurants, food, beer, non-alcoholic beverage, they'd give them a tube of hand sanitizer to go with it. Well, in steps the state, in steps the liquor board out in Maui, and they told them that they were breaking some prohibition-era law that prohibits incentivizing the sale of alcohol by giving away merchandise. So, there's a great owner over there, Garrett, who runs that company. We're in touch with him, and he's fighting back. But it just shows you how no good deed goes unpunished, and how private industry was doing the right thing, and the government regulators stepped in to do the wrong thing.
Well, let me share a couple of entrepreneurial updates that we at FEE have done. So one thing, obviously, we do a lot of seminars. We bring FEE's professors to classrooms, to high schools, to public high schools to actually educate people about liberty and economics. And as you know, all of them are shut down right now because, well, summer holidays, pandemic, all that. So what we did, I think in record time, we launched the online learning center, switched to webinars, and I think we're actually going to exceed our student numbers for this year because this online thing is just completely taking off. So let's say our classes on financial literacy, going great. Second, if you have never heard of TK Coleman, his fee is a revolution of one kind of tsar or director or leader, and this is a revolution of one is a series about character qualities, about entrepreneurship and individual liberty that goes to undeserved communities, and that had just basically taken off like a good kind of rocket in Instagram. And finally, let's say our learning center, in which we provide resources to be used in classrooms in public schools, once again, for your average teacher. That is basically being built out, it's being populated, and I think we're testing and piloting, but in fall, it's going to come out in full swing just because we got hit in a pandemic. So perhaps, coming to the previous question, yes, it is a disruption. Yes, it is awful. But then again, the world has seen many disruptions, and I think we have survived much worse than that. Right. If you like this unlicensed podcast, I don't know, telemarathon, call it whatever. If you like this one, please join us next time when we're going to be talking on Wednesday, May the 27th. Then we're going to be talking about fostering productive innovation for the future, and we're going to be talking we'll be talking with excellent scholars excellent scholars like Will Reinhardt and Ellie Dorado from Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. So if you're into future, if you want to know what future brings, come here, join us at May 27th at 1 p.m. And I want to thank our excellent panelists. I want to thank Ed and John. I think we had an excellent unlicensed broadcast. Let's do more of those. Thank you to all of our listeners. Thank you for people who could join us. And remember, FEE's online town hall is definitely a place where we have some really good conversations during these uncertain times. Thank you guys, and I shall see you next week.